I don't go into town more than I have to. Once a month, regular as clockwork, I hitch up the team, drive the rutted road into Hollow Bend, pick up nails, seed, sugar, tobacco things that don't grow out of dry ground, and lonesome effort. I don't linger. Folks don't ask me much, and I don't ask them back. But that day, I came out of the general store with a bag of flour slung under one arm and a strip of leather in the other. And I saw her. She was standing alone at the far end of the platform, where the noon sun had baked the boards hot enough to smoke the dust off your boots. A woman in a deep blue dress, hem ragged from travel, one suitcase beside her, and a shawl clutched tight under one arm. There wasn't a soul near her, just the wind kicking up grit and the sound of that train sighing like it was sorry to have brought her this far. She didn't look lost, not exactly. She looked held together, like someone who knew what it felt like to fall apart, but refused to do it where people might see. I leaned against the hitching post and watched her a while longer than I meant to. It wasn't her face that caught me first, or her clothes. It was how she stood, still, upright, not pacing or weeping or raging at the sky like some would have, just waiting. Like maybe the world had one more thing to take from her and she was daring it to try. She had a letter in her hand, creased, faded, clenched, too tight. I didn't need to read it to know what it said. I've seen that kind of letter before. Folks around here talk about mail-order brides like they're catalog orders, something to send back if it arrives with a scratch or wrinkle. She wasn't young, not old either, just real, worn but not broken, and I couldn't look away. People passed her by, some curious, most indifferent. Nobody stopped. Nobody called her name. After a while, the crowd thinned, the wagons rolled off, and the station fell quiet. She was still there. Just her and that letter and that battered case. After 20 minutes, she sat down, pulled the shawl tighter around her arms, even though the heat shimmered off the tracks. Her hands rested on the paper like it was the only thing left to explain how she ended up here. And maybe it was. I didn't plan to speak to her. Lord knows I've lived just fine without company. 10 years on that ranch with only the wind and my own thoughts for noise. But something about her stillness, about the way she didn't beg or run or ask for help, got under my skin. So I walked across the street. I didn't rush it. Didn't come with some line or intention. I just stood a few feet away and waited. When she finally looked up, I saw the guarded way her eyes held mine, like she expected the next thing to be just as disappointing as the last. "You waiting on someone?" I asked. She didn't flinch. Just said, "I was." No explanation, no apology, just the truth, plain as stone. I looked down the road, then back at her. "Ain't safe sitting here long. Folks will start asking questions." "I've had worse," she said, quiet-like. There wasn't pity in my chest, just recognition. I've been the one left behind before, seen too many good things go without warning. I wasn't looking to save her, but I didn't want to see her sit in the dust and be forgotten either. "If you need a ride," I told her, "I'm not heading far, just west a bit. You're welcome to sit the ride out of the sun." She blinked, studied me like a woman who's learned what it costs to trust too quick. I didn't move, didn't explain, just let her look. "You sure?" she asked. I nodded. "Ain't looking for anything, just don't like seeing folks stranded, that's all." She stood, lifted her own suitcase. I didn't reach for it until she was already walking, and even then I waited for her to let it go. Respect matters, even when you're offering kindness. We didn't speak again till we reached the wagon. 2 mules, slow as church service, a flat bed with a cracked bench seat. She climbed up beside me, sat with her hands in her lap, mine on the reins, and we rode like that, 2 strangers, alone together. She didn't say where she was headed, I didn't ask, but I knew, clear as I'd ever known anything, that ride would change more than just the direction we were going. If this story's got you by the heart the way it did me that day on the platform, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment below. Tell me if you've ever seen someone you couldn't look away from, because sometimes a life begins in the quiet, in the dust, when no one else is watching. The road back to the ranch was quiet, the kind of quiet that settles into your bones when you've spent years walking through noise. She didn't speak, and I didn't press. The mules plodded steady along the track, their hooves kicking up little bursts of dust, And every now and then, I'd glance sideways, not to stare, just to see if she looked like she might change her mind. She didn't. She sat straight, hands folded in her lap, not fidgeting, not watching me, just looking out at the land like she was trying to figure out what kind of place she'd landed in. I wasn't sure what I was doing. I'd brought strangers out to the ranch before, a few passers-by needing a warm meal or a place to mend a wagon wheel. But this felt different. She wasn't a stray. She was someone who'd been deliberately left behind. I knew the kind of weight that came with that. I carried it for years after my wife passed, after we buried our boy, after the neighbors stopped coming by, out of politeness and just left us alone. There's a different kind of silence that comes when no one expects you to need anything. And I'd gotten used to it, maybe too used to it. When we pulled up near the porch, I jumped down first, took her suitcase without a word. She didn't fight me on it. Didn't thank me either, which somehow felt more honest. I led her to the front steps, then paused. I hadn't prepared for this part. I hadn't planned to bring anyone home, hadn't cleared the spare room, hadn't dusted off the dishes, but I said it anyway. "You can stay in the spare room," I told her. "It's clean. Got fresh water, a cot." She stood at the edge of the porch like she wasn't sure if she was being invited in or dropped off again. I opened the door and stepped aside. "Supper's at sundown. I don't expect anything in return." She looked at me for a long second, then gave a small nod. "I'll cook," she said. "If that's all right?" I wasn't a man who needed convincing. I gave a short nod, and we left it at that. She moved quiet through the house, like someone used to making herself small, like someone who'd lived in places where her presence was tolerated, not welcomed. But she didn't shrink. She was watchful, yes, and careful, but not afraid. She noticed things, the photo on the mantel, the way the light hit the floorboards, the spot where the wind always rattled the back door just after dusk, and I noticed her noticing. That night, she cooked. Nothing fancy, just stew and a heel of bread warmed over. I sat at the table like I always did, same chair, same angle toward the fire. She moved around the kitchen like she'd been there before. When she set the bowl in front of me, our hands brushed. It wasn't much, but it was the first time in years I felt someone else's presence that close without flinching. We ate in silence, but it wasn't the cold kind. It felt respectful, like two people who had nothing to prove, nothing to sell, and too much history to make small talk. She didn't ask about the photo on the mantel, the one of my wife back when she still smiled like she had time ahead of her, and I didn't offer. There were things that didn't need telling, not right away. After supper, I sat out on the porch, 1 cup of coffee in my hand, 2 empty chairs beside me. I didn't expect her to come out, and she didn't, but the house didn't feel as empty, not even with just the sound of the wind and the creak of the boards beneath me. Inside, I heard her settling into the cot, the soft thump of boots placed beside the bed, the quiet hush of a shawl being folded. There was peace in that, the kind that doesn't come from relief, but from a kind of mutual stillness. 2 people not needing anything from each other but space to breathe. I didn't ask her plans. She didn't offer any. And when I rose at dawn the next morning, she was still there. No sign of retreat, no letter folded back into her palm. Just the smell of hot coffee coming from the kitchen and a 2nd cup already on the table. She didn't speak right away, just poured my coffee and set a bit of bread beside it. I nodded my thanks, and she gave a small tilt of her head in return. That morning, I went out to the pasture to check the west fence, and by the time I came back, the floors had been swept, the water pail was full, and the pans were drying by the stove. She didn't ask what needed doing. She just did it, and I didn't stop her, because the truth is, I'd gotten used to the silence, but for the first time in years, I didn't mind sharing it. The days that followed had no spoken agreement between us, but somehow we slipped into a rhythm, like we'd been moving in step a lot longer than we had. She didn't ask to stay, and I didn't tell her she could. She just didn't leave, and I didn't want her to. That was enough. Each morning, I'd wake to the smell of coffee already brewed and the scrape of her boots across the floor as she moved through the kitchen. She never tried to change anything, didn't rearrange my shelves or ask about how I liked my eggs, just noticed and adapted. That's a rare kind of attention, the quiet kind, the kind that comes from someone who's learned not to take up space until they know it's safe. I didn't need help around the place. I'd run it alone for years, But I won't lie, when I came in from the pasture and found my shirts washed and drying on the line, the barn swept out, or the wood box full without me asking, something about it settled me in a way I hadn't expected. Not because the work was done, but because it meant she was choosing to do it. Not for money, not for gratitude, just because she could. She never asked for instruction, just watched. Picked things up like she'd always known how to fit herself into places where she wasn't sure she belonged. I'd catch glimpses of her out the window, hanging linens, sleeves rolled up, her brow furrowed like she was trying to work something loose inside herself as much as she was wringing water from fabric. I kept busy with the usual tasks, mending fence posts, checking the water lines, keeping the livestock in check, but I found myself more aware of her presence than I wanted to admit. I'd glance toward the house without meaning to, just to see if she was still there, just to remind myself this wasn't some passing kindness I'd imagined. One afternoon, I saw her at the wash basin, arms deep in soap water, her face turned just enough for the sunlight to catch the curve of her cheek. And something about the sight hit me harder than it should have. Not like romance, not like want, more like recognition, that she was trying, without saying a word, to rebuild a life from nothing, same as me. It wasn't all quiet peace. Sometimes we passed each other with nothing but nods. There were days when her eyes were distant, like she was back on that station platform with that letter burning a hole through her hand. I didn't ask what she was thinking. I figured if she wanted me to know, she'd say. And I'll admit, there were nights I sat on the porch with my coffee and found myself setting the second chair just a little closer to mine. Not enough to make a point, just enough to make space. She never sat in it, but she noticed. We kept to ourselves mostly. Talk was spare, but not cold. It was practical, respectful. "I'll check the well," she'd say. "I'm headed to the pasture," I'd answer, and that was that. But every word between us felt earned. No fluff, no performance. I began to see her hands in everything, the pots scrubbed twice, my shirts folded instead of left in the basket, the pantry shelf dusted, and not a single question asked, just quiet effort, over and over, until it began to feel like she'd always been there. Then came that afternoon with the fencing wire. I was out by the back gate, trying to mend a loose post before the sun dropped too low. I was in a rush, and I'll admit, I wasn't being careful. One sharp slip and the wire bit into my forearm deep enough to make me swear aloud. Blood welled fast, and I pressed my hand over it, crouched there, muttering at my own foolishness, when I heard footsteps in the dirt behind me. I didn't turn right away. I didn't have to. It was her. She knelt beside me without a word, pulling a clean rag from her apron like she'd done it 100 times. She wrapped the wound tight, efficient but gentle, and I just let her. There was nothing in her eyes but focus, no panic, no scolding. Only when she tied off the wrap did she finally say, "You should have worn gloves." "I was in a hurry," I muttered, not meeting her eyes. She looked up at me then, and her voice was soft but sure. "You'll need clean water on it later." "I'll manage," I said. "I know you will," she replied. "That's not the point." And damn if that didn't land somewhere deep. She stood and walked off without waiting for a thank you, leaving me sitting there with a bloodied arm and the strange feeling that I wasn't as alone as I thought. That night, the house felt different, not louder, just fuller, like the walls had soaked in something they'd forgotten how to hold. And as I sat by the fire with that cup of coffee, I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in a long time. I wanted her to stay, not for help, not for the meals or the laundry or the company, just because she was here, and it already felt like she belonged. The cut itself wasn't much. I've had worse in the war, worse on this land. But somehow, that thin line of blood across my forearm stayed with me longer than most injuries ever did, not because of the pain, but because of what came after. I'd been out fixing the north gate. A section of fence had come loose again, the wire curling like a snake's tail in the sun. I was tired, rushing, and stupidly didn't take the time to put on gloves. I figured I'd be done in 10 minutes, just get it done before the heat really set in. But that wire snapped back when I wasn't paying attention, sliced a clean red line across my arm, and I cursed louder than I meant to. Dropped to a knee, clamped my other hand over it, blood already warming the cuff of my shirt. I hadn't even heard her walk up, but then she was there. No questions, no flurry, just the sound of her boots in the dust and the soft fold of fabric as she knelt beside me. She pulled a clean cloth from her apron. Lord knows how she always seemed to have something useful on her, and began wrapping the wound like she'd done it before, maybe 100 times. Her hands were sure, her movements gentle but not delicate. I sat there and let her tend to me like I didn't know how to do it myself. And maybe I did, but it felt different letting her do it. Felt like permission to stop pretending for a moment that I always had it handled. "You should have worn gloves," she said, voice low but steady. I glanced at her then, the sun behind her catching strands of her hair that had come loose, her brow furrowed just enough to show concern, but not judgment. "I was in a hurry," I mumbled. She didn't roll her eyes or sigh. She just tied off the cloth with a neat knot and looked up at me. "You'll need clean water on it later." "I'll manage." "I know you will," she said. "That's not the point." And I don't know what it was about the way she said it, but it sat with me. Like she wasn't just talking about the wound. She stood and left me there in the dirt, with my own breath in my chest, a little heavier than before. I didn't move for a while, just stared at the gate, the dust swirling around my boots, the dull throb of the cut reminding me that I hadn't been paying attention, not just to the wire, but maybe to everything. That evening the house felt quieter, not empty, not strained, just still. The kind of stillness that follows something small but important. She moved through the kitchen with her usual care, lighting the lamp, stirring the stew. I watched her from the armchair, my bandaged arm resting in my lap. She didn't speak unless she needed to, and neither did I. But the air between us wasn't full of things unsaid. It was full of things understood. She served me supper like always, sat across the table with her hands wrapped around her tin cup, eyes on the fire instead of me. I could feel her thinking. Not nervously, not angrily, just sifting through whatever had built up in her over the day. And I found myself wondering what she'd done before this, before Hollow Bend, before she stepped off that train with a letter in her hand and nowhere to go. I realized I didn't know the sound of her laughter, didn't know how she looked when she wasn't bracing for something, but I also realized I wanted to. When the fire had burned down and the dishes were cleaned, she didn't retreat to her room right away. She sat near the window for a while, mending something small in her lap, her head bowed, her hands moving like she could fix more than cloth with thread. I sat across from her polishing an old horseshoe, just to give my fingers something to do. I couldn't keep my eyes from drifting her way. And then I asked, without really planning to, "That letter you had at the station, was it from the man you came to marry?" She didn't look up, just kept sewing. "It was," she said. "He changed his mind before I even stepped off the train." I swallowed. Didn't feel angry, just tired for her. Tired of the way people think they can discard someone with a few strokes of ink. After a moment, I asked quietly, "You think he made the right call?" She finally looked at me then, eyes steady, calm, unflinching. "Doesn't matter what I think," she said. "He made it." I nodded, more to myself than to her. She was right. That man had made his choice. And maybe I was standing in the shadow of it now. Maybe I was the accident that followed. But I didn't feel like one, not anymore. She stood after that, quietly placed her mending back in the basket, and disappeared down the hallway. I listened to the soft shut of her door, the creak of the cot as she sat down, and I realized something I hadn't dared put into words before. This woman had been left behind, cast off, made to feel like time had passed her by, but not here, not under my roof, not if I had anything to do with it. It was the fire that finally pulled the words out of me. Not the flames themselves, but the way they move when everything else is still. I'd been watching it for the better part of an hour, long after the stew was gone and the tin plates were drying by the basin. She sat across from me, shoulders relaxed, but eyes always moving, and I could tell there was something folded up tight inside her, just like the letter that never left her side that first day. She hadn't mentioned it since, and I hadn't asked, but some silences aren't peaceful. Some are just places we hide because we're too tired to be disappointed again. I looked at her hands, steady in her lap, and thought of how they'd wrapped my arm the day before. Thought of how they'd scrubbed my pans, carried buckets, folded shirts that used to stay crumpled in the corner. Those hands didn't just work, they paid attention. and I couldn't let the quiet stretch any further without giving her something back, so I asked, slow and careful, "That letter, the one you held at the station, was it from a man you came to marry?" She didn't flinch, just kept her gaze on the fire like it was telling her everything she needed to hear. "It was," she said. "He changed his mind before I ever stepped off the train." I didn't know what to say to that. Nothing I could offer would undo the way that kind of rejection settles into a person's bones, but I felt something sharp inside my chest all the same. Not anger exactly, just a kind of grief for the version of her that had gotten dressed that morning thinking she'd be met, only to arrive and realize she was alone again. After a beat, I asked, "You think he made the right call?" She turned to look at me then, and I'll never forget how calm she was. Not bitter, not wounded, just clear. "Doesn't matter what I think," she said. "He made it." I nodded, feeling that truth roll around inside me like a small stone, hard, unchanging, final. We both turned back to the fire, letting the logs speak for us. I sipped my coffee, cold now, but I didn't care. She sat with her ankles crossed, not fidgeting, not folding into herself the way people do when they're waiting for the next blow. She'd stopped waiting, I realized. Somewhere between the station and the supper table, she'd stopped expecting to be dismissed. Not because I gave her reason to stay, but because she'd decided to stay on her own terms. "You don't talk much," she said after a while. "No," I admitted. I like that," she said, so soft it almost got lost in the crackle of the hearth. "Most people talk just to fill space." I looked at her again, and this time she was already watching me. There wasn't anything coy in her expression, just two people sitting in a room trying to figure out if they were allowed to stop being strangers. "I lost my wife 10 years ago," I said. "Fever took her fast. We had a boy, didn't make it to 2. Her face didn't change, but I saw the knowing settle in her eyes, not the polite kind, the real kind, the kind that says, "I've buried pieces of myself too." "I lost everyone," she said quietly. "Parents, brothers. The house I worked in closed down when the family moved east. There wasn't anyone left to notice if I disappeared." I set my cup down slowly. I noticed. It just slipped out, but once it did, I didn't want to take it back. She looked at me for a long moment, like she was deciding what weight to give those words. Then she nodded once, like she understood exactly what I meant, and exactly how hard it was for a man like me to say it. She stood not long after that and went to her room. Said goodnight over her shoulder, no fuss, just the same quiet way she entered every space. I watched the door close behind her, and I stayed by the fire, fingers wrapped around the cooling mug, wondering when exactly she'd stopped being a guest and started being something more, not a wife, not a lover, not yet, but a presence, a partner in silence. Later that night, I stepped out onto the porch. The stars were out clear, endless, stretching above the pines like a reminder of how much we'll never understand. I sat down in my chair and felt the absence of hers beside me, empty still, but not waiting anymore. She'd folded the letter away that morning. I'd seen it, lying untouched on the table near her cot. She didn't burn it, didn't tear it up, just stopped carrying it. That said more than anything she could have told me. And maybe that's what this whole thing was turning into. Not a romance, not a rescue, just two people who had every reason to give up and didn't. And I'll tell you something honest. That night, for the first time in what felt like years, I didn't feel like I was holding my breath. There's a certain quiet that settles over land like mine when the sun dips low and the wind goes still. The kind of quiet that doesn't ask for anything, doesn't press or pry, just lays down around you and lets you breathe. We were sitting on the porch that night, both of us wrapped in that quiet. She had a shawl pulled up over her arms. I had a cup of coffee in my hands, gone lukewarm but still comforting. The stars had just begun to show, pale at first, then brighter by the minute, and we hadn't spoken since supper. Didn't need to, but sometimes silence has a rhythm, and I could feel it shifting, moving us towards something that needed saying. "You were married," she said softly. I nodded. "She died 10 years ago. Fever took her quick, didn't give us time to fight it." There was no sting left in the saying of it. Not after all these years. The sharpness had worn down, dulled into a weight I'd learned to carry without thinking. But still, speaking it out loud made the night feel a little heavier. We had a son, I added, quieter now. He didn't make it past his second winter. Same sickness, same speed. She didn't say she was sorry. She didn't reach for some soft, hollow words. She just nodded, slow, like she understood loss not as an idea, but as a place you've lived in, a house with all the lights out and the windows boarded shut. I lost my family too, she said, all of them. Fever, cholera, bad luck. I buried the last of them 3 years ago. There wasn't anyone left to send a letter to. Wasn't anyone left to miss me. I turned my head, looked at her then, really looked. There was no sadness in her eyes, not anymore. Just the memory of it, like a scar that doesn't hurt but still changes how you walk. You ever think about going back east? I asked. No, she said, certain. There's nothing there for me now. I was tired of waiting for the rest of my life to begin. That stayed with me. The rest of my life. It sounded like something I should have said first. For a long while, we just sat, letting the breeze move slow across the porch boards. The lamp behind the window flickered a little. From the barn came the low rustle of the mules settling down. I sipped my coffee, cold now, but grounding. She stared out into the dark like she was finally letting herself believe it might not turn on her this time. You can stay, I said finally. She didn't look at me, not right away. Just let the words settle between us. No obligation, I added. Not for work, not for anything. You can just stay. She turned her head then. Her expression didn't shift much, but I caught the way her shoulders dropped just a little, like something she'd been holding up inside had finally been set down. I didn't plan on ending up here, she said after a moment, but it's the first place in a long time where I'm not waiting for something bad to happen. We sat with that truth for a while. I didn't press it. I just let it be. She didn't say yes, didn't give me her word or promise anything in return. But she didn't go to bed right away either. She stayed out there with me, long after the stars filled in above us, and the night settled into a kind of peace I hadn't known since before the war, before sickness hollowed out the house I built with my wife. And I realized then that staying doesn't always need a declaration. Sometimes it's enough just to remain. That next morning, her letter was gone from the table. Not burned, not thrown away, just folded neat and packed into the drawer where I kept the coffee tin and the matches, a place where things stay but don't haunt. When I came in from the pasture, I found 2 cups already set out, bread cut, and a second chair moved just a little closer to mine on the porch. Not much, just enough to say, I'm here, I haven't gone. The day passed like any other quiet chores, soft sounds of work, the smell of bread baking late in the morning. But everything had shifted, not loudly, just enough to be known. That night we sat on the porch again, no words, no reaching for something neither of us could name, just the sound of the wind moving through the grass and the warmth of knowing that in a world where everything changes, some things can still begin slow and strong and true. It was early evening when the rider came into view. I was just stepping out of the barn, wiping my hands on a rag, and Maggie was by the line hanging linens. The sun had that golden tint it gets when it's about to slip behind the hills, soft and low, like the land itself is catching its breath. I followed her gaze toward the ridge and saw the dust first, then the horse, then the shape of someone too upright, too deliberate to be lost. My stomach tightened before I knew why. Only a few people ever come out this way, and fewer still without sending word first. When the rider slowed to a stop by the gate, I knew before he even pulled off his hat who it was. "Afternoon, Thomas," Roy Heron called, his smile stretched too wide, his mustache twitching like it didn't belong on his face. "Roy," I said flatly, no warmth, just habit. He glanced toward Maggie, and I didn't miss how long his eyes lingered. She didn't move. Just stood there with her arms crossed, steady as a fence post, giving him nothing but silence. "Heard you've got company these days," Roy went on like it was a joke. But he wasn't here to gossip. He was sniffing around for something. He always was. "I'm not here to stir trouble," he added, holding up his hand like I'd accused him of it. "Just figured you'd want to know there's talk. Northerners eyeing the land past the ridge, big cattlemen, money behind 'em." I felt my jaw tense. "It's not for sale." "Didn't say it was. Just figured you ought to know." He tipped his hat again, gave Maggie one more look that didn't sit right, then turned his horse and rode off. The dust he kicked up took a while to settle, but the unease he left behind lingered even longer. "He always sniff around like that?" Maggie asked once he was out of earshot. "Only when he thinks someone's vulnerable." She didn't say anything after that, and she didn't need to. She knew the kind of man Roy was. Knew them like you know a burn before you touch the stove. We finished our chores quieter than usual that evening, but something in the air had shifted, like the house had drawn itself in a little, bracing. The knock came just after dark. I was by the table, sharpening a tool, and Maggie was by the hearth, stitching by firelight. We both looked up, still, waiting. I stood first, set the knife down slow, and crossed to the door, opened it cautious. And there she was, Rebecca. Hair pinned tight like it always was, coat dusty from the road, lips drawn into that same half-smile I remembered too well. Behind her stood a boy, lean and tall for his age, shifting from foot to foot like he didn't know where to look. "Thomas?" she said. "Didn't expect me." I didn't answer, just stepped aside so she could pass. She glanced around the room, eyes pausing on Maggie, who'd stood now, calm but alert, like a woman who knew how to be polite even when cornered. "Evening," Maggie said, her voice steady. Rebecca gave her a nod. "You must be Margaret Elsum. I help around the ranch." That answer hung there for a beat, and I watched Rebecca register the folded laundry, the second plate on the table, the scent of stew still in the air. She understood enough without asking. "This is Jonah," she said, motioning toward the boy. "My son." I nodded toward him. He barely nodded back. "My husband died last winter. Kansas was never good land. We've got nowhere else." I rubbed my jaw. "You're asking to stay?" "Just until I figure something out." Maggie stepped into the kitchen then, poured water without speaking, giving us space. But I knew she was listening, same as me. Rebecca didn't offer apologies, didn't try to explain the years of silence, the absence of letters. She just looked at me like the years hadn't passed, like the old version of me might still be standing here. "You'll have a roof," I said, "but the boy pulls his weight." "He will," she promised. That night, Maggie gave up her bed without a word, set up a cot near the fire, and told me, "It's only a few days," but I could feel it, that tightness returning to the house, the fragile ease we'd been building, now rattled by old footsteps. By the third day, Rebecca moved through the place like she'd always belonged, cooked breakfast, dusted shelves, said things that didn't need saying. As Maggie passed the table that morning, Rebecca gave her a look and said, "You've done well for yourself here, almost like a wife already." Maggie didn't flinch, just said, "I didn't come for that." Rebecca smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Doesn't mean you won't end up with it." Later that evening, I stepped outside where Maggie was rinsing dishes at the barrel. The sky behind her was soft with evening light. I stood beside her a moment before I spoke. "She's not staying long." "I know. She's not the reason I offered you a ride." "I know that too." I looked at her, but she kept her eyes on the basin. "Just thought, in case there's anything you're wondering." "I'm not wondering," she said. "I'm watching, and deciding if this is still where I belong." I swallowed hard. "Is it?" She didn't answer right away. Then softly, "So far." She turned and went back inside, leaving me there beneath a sky just beginning to darken, wind curling around the eaves. Rebecca had returned like a gust that lifts the dust, but when it settles, only the things meant to stay truly remain. After Rebecca left, the house felt larger, not just quieter. It had always been quiet, but more honest somehow, like it had let out a breath it had been holding since the knock on the door. She hadn't made a scene when she packed. No tearful goodbyes, no long looks. Just folded her clothes into a canvas bag, called for Jonah, and hitched the wagon with the same sharp efficiency she always moved with. Maggie stood on the porch, arms folded beneath her shawl, watching but not interfering. She understood it wasn't her place to close that chapter. Some things a man has to finish for himself. "You sure you'll be all right?" I asked as I tightened the harness. Rebecca gave a faint smile. "I always was. I just forgot for a while." Jonah climbed up beside her, glanced back once toward the barn, then down at the reins like he didn't know how to look at me, or maybe didn't want to. Rebecca turned toward Maggie just before she climbed up. "You keep him grounded," she said. I never could. Ever. Maggie didn't flinch, didn't gloat. She just nodded once, calm as ever, and said, "Safe travels." When the wagon disappeared over the ridge, I didn't say anything. I just turned back to the house, not hurried, not heavy-footed, just ready to return to what mattered. Inside, Maggie met me at the door. "You all right?" she asked. I shrugged. I reckon she always had a way of walking into a place like she'd never left, and walking out like she'd never been there. She didn't say anything for a moment, just stood there with that steady way of hers, like she saw something in me I hadn't figured out yet. "People like that don't stay long," she said. "No," I agreed. "They never do." That night after supper, Maggie washed the 2 plates like always. She didn't put the second one away. She just dried it, set it back in its place beside mine, and left it ready for the next day. That small act meant more to me than a dozen promises. Not because of the gesture, but because it said plainly, "I'm still here. This isn't temporary." And I noticed myself changing too, not in big, obvious ways, but in the kind you feel deep in your chest when the porch doesn't feel empty anymore. I started leaving small things for her to find, a folded pair of gloves by the front door, a few apples picked from the tree down by the creek, a tin of nails with a note that read, "For the chicken fence." It wasn't courtship, not like I'd ever known it. It was something quieter, more certain, like offering her a key without needing to say the door was hers. One afternoon, I found her in the barn, sleeves rolled up, scrubbing the old saddle blanket against the washboard. I handed her a dipper of water and stood beside her without saying much. She drank, passed it back, and I watched the way her hands moved. Practiced, sure, strong. I'd known her months by then, and still she didn't ask for anything. Didn't expect. So I asked what I'd been carrying for days. "Why haven't you asked me to stay?" she said, not looking up. I swallowed. "Because I don't want to assume. You were left behind once. I figured you'd stay if you wanted, go if you didn't." She glanced at the wood wall beside us, then back at me. "I've stayed," she said. I noticed. She leaned a little closer, just enough to make the space between us feel shared. "It's not just fence mending, Thomas," she said. "This is a life, and you've been sharing it with me like it's no big thing, but it is." I set the hammer down, turned to her fully. "I want you here," I said. "Not as a guest, not as someone passing through, as my partner, as the woman who sits beside me at the end of the day and makes this place feel less empty." She didn't move for a while, just let that settle. Then she said quietly, "I don't need flowers or a ceremony. I didn't figure you did. But I want to know I matter, not just for what I do, but because I'm here." "You matter," I said. "Every day since the first." We stood there in the still of that old barn, dust drifting in the light from the loft window, and I felt something in me shift, not snap, not break, just ease, settle into place. That night, I burned the beans a little and forgot to salt the potatoes, but Maggie sat across from me with a faint smile like it didn't matter. And when the meal was done, I reached into my pocket, pulled out a small thing I hadn't touched in years, a worn silver locket that once belonged to my wife. I slid it across the table to her. "She'd want it used again," I said. Maggie opened it slowly. Inside were 2 empty spaces meant for photographs. "We'll take one," she said, "sometime." She reached across the table, took my hand, and didn't let go. That night, she slept in her own bed again, and I sat on the porch long after the fire had gone out, her second chair no longer waiting to be filled, but simply filled. Summer came slow that year. The frost lingered too long in the gullies, and the grass across the far pasture never quite reached the height it used to. But we didn't complain. We just rose with the sun and did what needed doing. The house didn't feel like a place I lived alone anymore. It felt lived in, like breath moved through it that wasn't just mine. Maggie moved through the rooms like she'd always belonged there, soft-footed, sure-handed, and steady as the wind that brushed across the porch each morning. The garden behind the house had started to take. She worked it every morning, sleeves rolled, knees in the dirt, humming sometimes without realizing. Marigolds bloomed along the porch rail, bright, cheerful things, and rows of carrots and beans pushed up through soil that had been hard-packed and stubborn for years. I used to think nothing could grow there. just needed someone patient enough to try. We worked side by side most afternoons. She'd hand me tools without asking. I'd steady boards while she hammered, both of us quiet, comfortable in the way our movements fit together. It wasn't chore work anymore. It was building. We were making something lasting, even if we never called it that out loud. There was no ceremony, no vows spoken under any roof but this one. But her things, few as they were, had started filling drawers that had once stayed empty. The blue blanket she'd carried with her off the train was folded now at the foot of my bed. 2 tin cups always sat by the basin instead of one. Her shawl hung next to my coat on the peg by the door. I caught myself watching these details like a man checking to see if the dream held when the light changed. And it did, day after day. We'd sit on the porch after supper, the way we always had, only now it didn't feel like passing time. It felt like sharing it. No rush, no destination. Just her beside me, coffee in hand, eyes on the same stretch of sky. Sometimes we talked, sometimes we didn't. But the quiet had changed. It wasn't a wall between us anymore. It was something we built together, a space we both filled just by being there. One evening I hitched the wagon and told her I'd be back before dark. Didn't say where I was headed. She didn't ask, just gave me a small nod and went back to the bread she was kneading. That was Maggie, never needing to follow me with questions, just trusting that if something mattered, I'd bring it home. I rode into town, took care of what I came to do, and came back with a small crate in the bed of the wagon. Inside were 2 pullets, young hens, pale-feathered and wide-eyed. I brought them into the kitchen and set the crate down while she was washing up from supper. I figured, Sim, I said, if we're staying here for good, we might as well have eggs that don't come from town. She looked at the hens, then at me. That why you really went? I smiled, just barely, and reached into my shirt pocket. Not just that. I pulled out a folded piece of paper, creased from the ride but still crisp, and handed it to her. It wasn't a marriage license. That never felt like the point. It was something else, a deed update form from the county clerk's office. Her name now sat beside mine, not just as a resident, but as co-owner of the land. I watched her face as she read it. She didn't cry. Maggie wasn't the crying sort, but something in her eyes softened, like a knot inside her had finally loosened. I was going to stay anyway, she said. I know, I replied, but I wanted it to be yours too. She folded the paper carefully, no rush, and placed it in the drawer by the stove, the same drawer where she'd once tucked that letter from the man who'd left her stranded. That drawer held a different kind of paper now. A few days later, I came home from the pasture to find the mantle changed. The photo of my late wife, the one with her soft eyes and pin curls, was gone, not discarded. Maggie had dusted the frame, cleaned the glass, and tucked it gently into a cedar chest with care. In its place was a new photo, grainy, stiff, just the 2 of us, me forgetting how to smile, Maggie squinting into the sun. But it was ours, and that was when I knew. We'd stopped surviving and started living. Folks in town noticed, of course. They didn't say much, not in Hollow Bend, just nodded a little longer when they saw us. No one asked who she was anymore. She was just there, same as me. Part of things. That winter came early, dry snow, hard winds. I built a second shelf in the pantry to hold her preserves. She knitted me new gloves. Some nights we talked, some nights we didn't. But always we sat close. Always we stayed. On Christmas morning, we didn't exchange gifts. We sat under a blanket on the porch, watching the snow fall over the corral. The air was sharp, but the silence was warm. I looked at her, steam rising from our mugs, and said, I was thinking we ought to tear down that old shed come spring. She nodded. Could put up a chicken coop. I paused. You still glad you stayed? She turned to me, eyes soft with truth. I'm glad you didn't leave me standing at that station. I reached for her hand. I didn't know what I was doing that day, I said. She smiled, just a little. You didn't need to. You just needed to stop. And I did. Funny how a life can turn. One day you're standing in the sun outside a store with nothing on your mind but feed and fence wire, and a week later you've got a second plate set on the table and someone humming in the kitchen, like she's been there her whole life. That's the thing about change. It doesn't ask permission, it just shows up. Sometimes with a suitcase, sometimes with silence. Maggie never asked for anything more than space to stand, and over time, I stopped waiting for her to leave. She was never passing through, I just hadn't known how to see it yet. That first winter together was the kind that presses close to the bones. Snow fell early and deep, and the wind cut through the valley like it was carving it new. I built a better shelf in the pantry, not because we needed the room, but because her jars of peaches and pickled beans deserved it. She knitted me gloves I wore until the wool gave out. And every night, without fail, we sat side by side near the stove or on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, the world slowing down just enough to feel like it made sense. Some nights we didn't talk at all, didn't need to. There's a kind of quiet that holds you together better than words ever could. And somewhere in all of that, the shared chores, the meals, the thousand small kindnesses, we became something that didn't need a name. We weren't two people with pasts we were still trying to outwalk. We weren't waiting for something better. We were it, the something better. I remember the day we tore down the old shed. Snow was gone finally, and the ground was soft underfoot. She handed me the pry bar, and we took turns, side by side, knocking loose boards and tossing them into a growing pile. It wasn't the work that stayed with me. It was the way she smiled when a beam cracked clean, how she wiped her forehead with the back of her wrist and said, "Guess this place really is ours now." We built the coop together over a week, me with my slow hands, her with her clever ones. When we finished, she stood back and crossed her arms, proud but not boastful, and said, "That'll do." And I realized right then, I didn't remember the sound of the house before her. Didn't want to. She'd become the rhythm I moved to. One morning, not long after the hens began laying, I woke to find the porch swept clean, a pot of coffee already brewing, and a second photograph sitting on the mantel beside the first. It was the two of us again, taken by a traveling photographer who passed through town. I looked older than I remembered feeling. She looked straight into the camera, not smiling, not posing, just present. That was her way. No performance, just truth. And here's the truth I've come to understand. A life doesn't ask for ceremony to be real. It just asks to be lived, and lived with someone, not around them. There was no proposal between us, no ring. But her name was on the deed, and her shawl hung by my coat, and her boots sat by the door every night without fail. She stayed, not because she had to, not because I asked, but because she chose to. And I've learned something from that, from her, that love, the kind that lasts, doesn't come in loud. It doesn't show up with flowers or declarations. It shows up quietly, with rolled sleeves and warm bread, and hands that hold yours without asking for anything in return. It shows up with forgiveness and patience, and the courage to stay even when the past has taught you to run. I used to think I was done with hope, that the best of my life was buried in the years I'd already lived. But Maggie taught me different. She taught me that a second beginning doesn't feel like a thunderclap. It feels like a second plate on the table, like marigolds by the porch, like someone saying, "I'll cook," when all you expected was silence. So if you've made it this far, listening to the slow, quiet story of two people who found each other late, thank you. These kinds of stories don't shout, they don't dance, but they mean something, they're real. And if it stirred something in you, if it made you remember someone, or hope for someone, or think maybe it's not too late to start again, I'd be mighty grateful if you'd give this video a like, drop a comment, and follow the channel. There's more where this came from, because out here, in the wide, quiet places, where the wind speaks soft and the past keeps its distance, love still grows. You just have to stop long enough to let it find you. And when it does, don't walk away. Sit down, pour the coffee, and stay.